This is the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm Richard McCall here in Monpos, Bolivar. That's 5 hours south of Cartagena in the Caribbean region. My very special guest is in Bogota. It's Andrei Gómez Suárez. For those of you who are up to speed on Colombian politics, they'll know that he's a specialist in international relations, Colombian politics, of course, peace dialogues and more. He's an academic, University of Winchester, Oxford University, Edinburgh University, all sorts of things. In fact, I couldn't read out all of his resume here if I wanted to because he's so very equipped. But he's back on the podcast after a little delay. So welcome, Andrei.
Hi, Richard. It's great to be here with you and great to be back at the Colombia Calling podcast. Such a great endeavor you have created.
Thank you very much. And as I say always, flattery will get you everywhere. Andrei, the first time you were ever on the podcast, it was Gwen and yourself, so your partner, way back. I don't think I even had children back then. You certainly didn't have children back then, child back then. But and we discussed the points of the peace accord, 2016. It was fascinating. Of course, you were very heavily involved in writing academia about this, and well, life has moved on, and we've seen ourselves go into different ways. And why we're talking and well, what we'll talk about is a lot of Colombia's politics and current issues and so on. But the main reason is we have a book coming out. Andrei has a book coming out published by my little editorial, Fuller Vigil. And we have an event on the 10th of July at Cultivo Libros. That's on Calle 64, just below the Septima, half a block below the Septima. And it will be a little event of the book launch. That's pretty exciting, isn't it, Andrei?
Really, really exciting. I've been working on that book since 2018, I believe. So, it's been the book that's taken the longest. And it's great to see it live in Bogota. Fantastic to do the book launch, taking the advantage of me being in Bogota and just before going back to Edinburgh. So, Bogota first, and then probably we will do a book talk in the Edinburgh Festival. So that's
really?
A good thing to do.
Will you be able to do that? Wow, that's international.
There's some interest on it, so we will see if we make it happen.
That's amazing. Well, I have to say that I am in conversations about printing in the UK. So with the books from the editorial, it'll be small print runs, and it's all about then a driving interest within sort of smaller independent bookshops and then them buying. But it's a whole process it's a very much a learning process. But let's just say, tell my listeners the title of the book and how it came about.
Well, the book's called We Are Not Made of Sugar. And the whole idea came about when I was doing an academic research with the University of Bristol. And we were working on a project called Memories from the Margins. And that project was about going and talking to communities in different regions of Colombia and understand how they were doing memory work on everyday life. And then COVID happened, and I was locked, and I couldn't go and do the field work that I needed to do. And I somehow thought, well, why not do what the communities are doing and try to do a bit of memory work and speak about what I had seen when I was growing up. And so I started exploring my own memories of my childhood. And it became the continuation of my PhD, because my first book was an academic book on the destruction of the Patriotic Union in Colombia. And this book was not an academic book, but was the personal account of what I remember I saw growing up in Narino when the genocide of the UP was taking place. So that's how the book came about and took a life of its own.
So you turned your studies back on yourself. So yes. You turned your investigation back on yourself. Can you give us a little bit of a background of when you went, the idea of Memories of the Mountains, you were talking to local communities to get them to reflect on what had taken place? Is it a way of sort of reconciliation of the past?
No, actually, what we were doing was asking them how they were trying to deal with the past. And what we discovered is that that was a work that they were doing on everyday life. They had created their own museums, they had created their own songs to talk about those things that were really important part of the past. They have created their own food. They have created dishes that were connected to the memory of a painful past. And it was documenting those sort of things. Why did you create that recipe out of a massacre? Or how did that song, that vallenato song, came about? And how close it is to the experience of other people in the region. So, like helping also to think about how they were using art and how that was part of a process of reconciliation that we could learn from. It was more than they learning from us and we helping them to shape these projects. It was us learning from what they were doing in order to have a meaningful present and to heal the wounds of the past.
Well, obviously, I really do believe that most of Colombia suffers from PTSD, and there has to be this sort of healing process, whichever way it comes. I am particularly interested in that as someone creating a recipe based on like something that happened in the past. What kind of recipe? I mean, I have to. Did you see or try something that like a dish?
I did, and actually, out of the project, we wrote a sort of short, a small booklet with the recipes for reconciliation. And, it's connected to how when a territory is completely destroyed, how people have to go back and recover a staple food that they thought had forgotten because they had gotten used to eat food that was, coming from other regions. And suddenly, when there is a strike that doesn't allow food to get into the region, you have to go back and see what there is on the ground and try to cultivate it. And out of that, think, for 20 odd years, we haven't used these sort of beans to eat and survive. And now we have to go back to that. And people sort of reconnect with their roots and finding that reconnection a new beginning. And sort of there are some recipes connected to that sort of experience and delicious dishes.
I like this very much. I see it as trying to channel back and grasp with your hands. It's tangible, isn't it? The culture that is erased, or the culture that has been tried to be erased by the conflict. So much in Colombia, and then of course you have the violence that manifests itself within the earth and the soil itself. People don't go back to it. Maybe something of great emotional importance has taken place there. The fields are abandoned. So I can see the connections that go through this. I mean, originally I thought, oh, what, a dish. But now I can see the connection. It's all about the different violences, the different layers. You mentioned previously about your first book, the academic book, which is, of course, made up of your PhD thesis, and it's the Unión Patriótica, the Patriotic Union, which was you're better positioned to explain it, but it was a group formed of former FARC guerrillas who then moved into politics, and this is in the 1970s or 80s?
1985.
Okay, so it's a group formed of those, and then over time there was a systematic genocide of the members of this party, and this is very, very key to your book, We Are Not Made of Sugar, because it's a common theme the whole way through there, because your family was connected to the UP, the Patriotic Union.
Yes, absolutely. So whereas in the first book that I wrote, I sort of took a huge, distance from the experience of the child, and I sort of created a whole theoretical framework in order to understand something that I saw as happening to others, to happening to the party, as you mentioned. And I created a concept that is being used in different for different experiences of genocide, that is perpetrator block. What I said is that in the case of Colombia in the between 1985 and 2010, a perpetrator block made of different actors like drug traffickers, paramilitary groups, state security forces, politicians, cattle ranchers, you name it, came together in a historical moment because all of them saw as their own enemy members of the UP. And that created different sort of phases of the genocide. And so all of this was theorizing how that took place and how that was connected to the geopolitics of the moment. So that's the reason why I talk about a genocidal geopolitical conjuncture. The book was published first in English by Routledge in 2015. Then the University of Los Andes translated the book and published it in Spanish because it was doing a contribution to a case that was not heavily theorized in the case of Colombia, even though many people were talking about it. It was like, oh, genocide of the UP, but without really the theoretical grasping that needed to have. And I was sort of contributing to debates in genocide studies and international politics. Now, this book completely ignores that and goes to the experience of a child who is 10 years old and suddenly one day see that one of the comrades of his parents who had been visiting the house just a week before gets killed. And is what happens to that boy after that moment, and what happens to the family, and how that family that is connected to different regions of Colombia is also trapped in a historical moment in which the country is divided, and the experience of the UP is experience that is not understood by many people, including part of his family. So the boy is growing and trying to make sense of it. So it's a completely different experience. What I did was pretty much what I saw the communities doing in Montes de Maria. Was like, how do I go back to what I saw? And do I have to come to terms with what I saw and what we experienced? And that's what the book tells in 200, I think it's 300 pages.
It's a fascinating one because, in Colombia, there are references, as you say this, references made in news articles and so on about the genocide of the UP. But as you say, it's really not studied in depth. It's just sort of it almost to me feels like a footnote of what took place. And so therefore your academic book, which I will admit to not having read, but one day I will. I'll find it one day. I know it's all sold out as well. So I have not read your academic book, but it would be because I geek out on things like this. It's of interest to me. But your personal, again, your personal memoir on this, you lift a veil on what it means to be a young boy in the midst of this, in, I would say, an intermediary city in Colombia. So we're looking at Pasto, in Narino, where violence is, I think, more present in the intermediary cities. It's more immediate rather than a big city like Bogota where you can sort of isolate yourself. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I feel in the smaller places because people know one another more. And it seems to me you write and you almost start writing about this great pastoral upbringing in southwestern Colombia, this wonderful place, and then, as you said, that first assassination takes place, the first murder, not in your house or anything, but of the politician who was recently in your house, and it hits you in the gut as a reader you really you bring us up to a point and then drop us off a cliff on it. And I think, I don't know if I'm going to read anymore because it is very impacting. So, and then you go to more. and I wonder for you, how cathartic was it writing this book? Because obviously it was during COVID. I mean, we were all in deep periods of reflection.
Yeah. I think for many years, when we talk about this with my parents, the whole idea was that we were not victims of this, that that it was what happened in Colombia, that was normal, and that you get on with it. When I did my PhD and I started researching on it and I started doing genocide studies, I thought this is not normal. And actually, this did happen to us. And actually, it was a really important moment in which I understood that what I was doing for my PhD and my master's was part of coming to terms with the past. But I always put some distance between coming to terms with that and sort of, like I felt that I needed to do that because my parents had given so much for it, and it was part of our family process to write that book as my PhD. And I thought I had done the catharsis. I thought I was done with it. But when I went back into this memoir, and I had to get into the everyday life, and I started really digging into the memories, then I felt that there were still unresolved issues there. For example, a deep sense of distrust in society, because when you feel that no one understands your suffering, you really don't trust anyone. And that's a difficult thing to really connect at some point. And then, but also, what I think it was amazing, because of course the book of the academic book offers a glimpse of hope, because it talks about the strategy of resistance of the UP. And that is what I call an anti-genocidal international network that the UP tried to create to survive the violence. But what I think is and even though I did that, the book of the genocide of the UP, the academic book, shows how complicated Colombian society was and how deep the wound for the members of the UP was with the genocide. And when I was writing my memoir, and I got into these dark moments of listening, for example, my parents, things like, they have killed all our heroes, they can kill us now. And when you are 10 years old, listening to something like that your mom is saying that in your everyday life, that really hits you and makes you feel, hopeless. But then, and that was something that probably stayed there for a long time. But then the beautiful thing of the memoir, I think, is what happened is that next to those dark, really hopeless moments, human beings, and my family in particular, had moments of happiness. And there were things that were light and were amazing and helped us to move on. And so I started connecting dark things with things like falling in love with a girl who was in my school, and how that was very much part of me being able to see that life in that moment was much more than the dark moments of the tremendous difficult violence that members of the UP suffered, that had a direct impact on my mom, my dad, my sister, and me, because the politics was not just like a hobby. Is when, when in this moment in time, and for members of the Communist Party at least, being part of the UP was like the most important endeavor they had in their life, because they were going to change the country. They were going to change the country for the better. So they invested heavily their lives into that, putting their family at risk. And sort of, so I think that's the beauty of the memoir, to help heal those dark moments by knowing that there were bright moments taking place.
It's one of those things, is a lot of times, to a lot of people, who are absent physically from the conflict in Colombia. They kind of live a parallel life, but yours is parallel, but then it crosses, because you've got the UP crossing it all the time. We need some data here, and I know that you've got it in your head. The genocide of the UP, more or less, how many people were assassinated and murdered?
The numbers are still up for discussion, but let's say that altogether, the victims of the UP, and I think in this we need to include not only assassinations, but internally displaced people. We need to include also disappeared people because we don't know what happened to them, assassination threats, torture, and things like that. We're talking that more than 6,000 people suffer levels of violence of a small group. That was, so I think that's what we are talking about. But at least half of those, so we're talking about 3,000 of them were assassinated. So murders of 3,000 members of a political party were killed for belonging to that party. And then there were many other sectors that were not even members of the party, but they were, for example, the relatives of members of the UP who also suffered violence because they were connected to them. And so when we are talking about genocide, it's not only the members who had an identity card saying this is a member of the party, but it's all the social network around the members of the party. And that is, it's difficult to calculate the huge impact that had in that sector of society.
It's hard to stomach when you think it's just the political party. It's a political party, and of course all of the extensions of the families and the political party. It's not like completely random. It's entirely. Were at any point, and I know it's in the book, but at any point, you and your family were directly under threat? Andrei.
Yeah, sorry. One of the episodes in which I mentioned in one of the chapters is when my dad was tortured and how the feeling of being threatened became a feeling of our everyday life. And it was not because they were killing people in other regions of the country, because I have to say that Pasto at the time was a region in which the violence, in general, violence was not at the same level that was in the middle of Magdalena Valley. It was a rather peaceful region. There were tortures taking place. There were some threats happening, but they were not like the massacres or the assassinations that were taking place in other parts. But that said, and perhaps for many people in Narino, the idea of this violence against the UP taking place in Colombia was something that they could completely ignore. But in my family, I could not.
Mm-hmm. It's so hard. You talk about your family reacting as if it's just sort of normal. We'll just get on with it. But like you said, you in your period of reflection as well, it's like this isn't normal. We can't become accustomed to this, and I think that's one of the huge challenges that Colombia has. Because we're like, there's always violence in the countryside, and there's always this, and there's always that. It's like we can't become jaded to it, because then it is normal, and it's not normal for people to be killed, and it's not normal for people to be, disappeared. And I wonder, not only in your personal sort of reflections, but also in your academic work, where you're writing these things down, you just go, God, but it is customary here. I sometimes, because you go, living anywhere, we go through peaks and troughs. Oh my God, this. Oh my God, that. How do you sometimes distance yourself? Like one of my professors in conflict resolution, when I studied in the Javeriana, she used to talk about stepping up onto the balcony and looking down, sometimes just separating yourself a little bit to be able to be a bit more objective about things. Is there anything that you do to be able to separate yourself on occasion, because every day you're dealing with, stories and negotiations which are incredibly complex and, I would say, emotionally draining.
Yeah. Well, I'm quite lucky that I found two things in the middle of my PhD, I guess, because then that's when really, I start thinking more on this and working on this. And the first thing is it got deeper into Taoism. And Taoism has got lots of meditational strategies and Tai Chi movements, and I sort of practice this sort of meditation on a daily basis, and it's so useful, really. But then the second one is running. I use my everyday life running to sort of uh, observe and understand, like that within the big picture of things, you can always do small things, but that within those things you need to trust the way things are, and that trust that your contribution is helping to make things better, but that there are many things that are out of your control, and that the important thing is to feel that you are connected to streams of change that go beyond this selfish idea that you can be a hero.
It's a tough one, isn't it? You've channeled, let's say, energies into newer, into different methods, Taoism, running, and of course, this is something that I'm sure you're discussing a fair amount at the moment. Could you tell us, because your career has taken a fascinating pathway, and I think we see it in the book. I think we see the way it's going. You, as you said, you deal with things by falling in love. You deal with things by, maybe you bury things by partying and football and so on and so forth. And then you kind of become what I'd say is a regular student in Bogota. But then it all changes, but we don't want to give too much of the book away. But then it all changes. There's a change towards the end where maybe some of these activities are lifted a bit. But I'm moving on. I'm jumping on decades now. Can you, because it is fascinating, can you tell us what it is you're doing at the moment in Colombia?
So yeah, Richard, as I, after becoming an academic and dealing with the destruction of the UP, in 2013, I set up this peacebuilding organization called Rodemos el Diálogo, that we have discussed that many times also in the podcast. Because the whole idea behind the UP was to build peace in Colombia. So my parents were not only the members of a political party, but what I think, or the way how I saw them, was they were peace builders. And so in 2013, after writing the book, becoming an academic on genocide, and that really gets into your emotions, I felt I needed something brighter. And I thought, well, this is the moment. And when the peace process with the FARC started in 2012 with President Santos, I thought this was like a second chance that I had to finish the job that my parents had started in 1985 when they had tried to do the same. That's the reason why they joined the UP, because they saw it as a way for the FARC to give up their weapons and to build a peaceful country. So I thought, this is 2012. Many years later, I have the same chance. I stopped just complaining and criticizing and making, demands to the state for the reparation of the UP, and actually move on into what does it take now to build a peaceful Colombia in the middle of a negotiation between Santos and the FARC. And by setting up this peace building organization, now I started a double life as an academic, as a practitioner. And I kept working on peace building from civil society. That was my job between, I would say, 2012 And 2022, I ran that organization. I set up the organization and then I moved constantly between academia and a practitioner in terms of peace building as such. So I became an expert on transitional justice, restorative justice. I started working on security mechanisms for members of illegal armed groups once they demobilized, and so on and so forth, and dealing with memory, reconciliation, and issues like that. But in 2024, last year, President Petro and the High Commissioner for Peace called me and invited me to be a delegate or representative of President Petro in the negotiations with the splintering group of the ELN called Comuneros del Sur, a splintering group that has a territorial control in Narino. So when they offered me this, it was like a full circle, something that I hadn't done, in the sense that the work that I was doing in the middle of the peace process with the FARC was at the national level, but not specifically in the region where my whole life had started. And so when they offered me the idea of being a delegate in this peace process, I could not say no, because it's like going back to the city where I was born to talk to the illegal armed group that has been fighting against the Colombian state for the last 32 years, and that's got territorial control in some of the municipalities that I visited as a child, and that some of my best friends, one of my best friends, is from there. So I'm connected to that. And somehow I had finished writing the book. Actually, now that we're talking about the book, just before the government offered me that, because they called me, I think it was on the 5th of July 2024. And just before that, I had finished a research project on unarmed civilian protection in Narino. And I was finishing this book, and I had promised an epilogue that I was going to write, because it was one of the suggestions of Richard. And I wrote that epilogue in Pasto a year before, on the 20th of July, 2023, without knowing that a year later I would be stepping on the shoes of the government to start a peace process with Comuneros del Sur that I've been working on for the last year.
It's kind of incredible. What was the emotion when you got that phone call? How did you feel?
Torn, because I felt like, what does it mean? Going back to live in Pasto? I'm sorry, I cannot do that. I have a baby who is about to be born in Edinburgh. I live in England. I'm a British citizen now. I have a life in the UK. So it was like, yes, we're coming back to full circle, but I don't see how we're gonna make this work for everyone. So we had a long conversation, trying to see, whether I could really deliver what they were expecting. And I think in this digital age, we've managed to do the best of it, because sometimes, I'm not like the chief negotiator who is 100% of the time in Narino. I'm only a bit of the time there. So I fly between Edinburgh and Pasto, which is weird, to work on these negotiations. But having the distance is very useful in order to have headspace to take strategic decisions and to be able to work on the important elements of the design of a very sophisticated peace process that we have in this moment in Narino. So it is quite useful. And because I'm exposed to academics in the UK, I'm part of academic network working on peace building in the UK, and everyone is looking at the whole globe and the different efforts that are taking place across the world in order to build peace. I'm able to sort of implement in Narino, or suggest and put on the table, like key ideas that are coming from other places. But I'm also, so it's really useful to have this, but it was very difficult to create the right sort of piece of the puzzle for make this happen.
I see that thing. This distance is your balcony. That's how you're doing it. There we have it. Where we've come around to it. I know you're a busy guy. I think it's incredible. And we will be talking at length on the 10th of July in Cultivo Libros. For those of you interested, those of you in Bogota or coming to Bogota, please. Just very quickly, final point here. How is the peace agreement? How are the peace dialogues going with the Comuneros del Sur, in which you are involved?
We've made tremendous progress. The peace process is a young process. It's been only going on formally from the last 9 months, since September last year, and we've signed 11 partial agreements. Last month in Pasto, we signed an agreement to create a zone for the decommission of weapons and the reintegration of Comuneros del Sur. That's going to be created in one of the 10 municipalities that we have prioritized in Narino. We signed that agreement with the support of the indigenous community that owns the territory. Now we are working on the protocols. We need to craft some security protocols for that to happen, and we are going to do a consultation with the whole population in that municipality in order to make sure that it's a democratic process and that people are on board with this, because this zone will change the whole landscape of the region. It would transform that municipality that is between Tumaco and Pasto into a epicenter of peace building. And I think we need to we need to have everyone on board. And so I think the process is, we are getting towards the last stage. That means that we sort of have built enough trust between the parties. We've seen very serious political will from Comuneros del Sur. They have handed over a stockpile of weapons. We destroyed 585 weapons in April this year, in the middle of a negotiation. I don't know of any illegal group. It's unheard of. And actually it was destroyed. It was handed over to the Organization of American States, but it was destroyed by the military of Colombia, which I also think is a key development and a difference from the FARC peace process, because there is enough trust that is the Colombian army the one who is destroying the arms of Comuneros del Sur. So we have that. We have enough trust. We've seen the political will by the destruction of this stockpile of weapons. We've seen now the political will, and a next important development that we're going to start the process of concentrated members of Comuneros del Sur in one zone, connected to an indigenous community, so that it's going to be an epicenter of community reintegration. So trying to help with the reconciliation process, because there are many victims of Comuneros del Sur in those municipalities. And so this is the way to work on reconciliation in the territories where it matters. But we are starting the last stage of the negotiation, that is perhaps the most challenging one, because it's finding a legal framework, it's finding what we have called a judicial security approach for the members of the group, because no one signs a peace agreement to go to jail for 40 years, and the Colombia legal framework is very restricted on that. And then the second part of this tough part of the negotiation that we're working on is a security model for the region, because in Narino there are more than a dozen of illegal armed groups in the surrounding areas who are just waiting to see what happens with Comuneros del Sur to step in. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. We don't want to put the communities at risk. We don't want to put the members of Comuneros at risk. And we need to make sure that the transformation that we are working on in Narino, because we have started doing Coca crop substitution, we've been building roads, rebuilding schools. We want all of that to generate a sustainable peace, but that requires a new model of security for the region, and we need to work on that. And that's part of the last part of the negotiations that we have to be working on.
Justice, security, and then every different modernity, human right applied at the same time. Schools, clinics, communication, roads. It's a big deal. But listen, you've got this far. You don't need what happened after the FARC as that power vacuum that for some reason was left available for all the different armed groups when the FARC left many territories. But I know, again, you're a busy guy. This has been absolutely fascinating. All of this leads into the book. All of this has its roots in your memoir, We Are Not Made of Sugar, a childhood memoir from Colombia. It's a fantastic read, shortly to be on Amazon. And we have the launch on the 10th of July in the bookstore Cultivo Libros, Calle 64, just below the Septima. Very intimate place, fun place to go. Come along, hear Andrei speak, take questions. And if any of you, our listeners, have questions, send them to me and I'll pose them to Andrei as well. Maybe we can set up a live stream. I don't know how to do that, but maybe one of you out there can come along or can advise me on that. So Andrei Gómez Suárez, thank you so much for your time and sharing parts of your story here on the podcast.
Thanks, Richard. A great pleasure to be here. And I'm sure that after we do the book launch, we will do a follow-up on updating on the peace process with Comuneros del Sur that I think deserves a lot of attention from people now because it's got key innovations in peace building. And I think we need more awareness about what's going on. So delighted to be here and hope we can see some of your listeners in Cultivo Libros next week in Bogota.
Yeah, you can sign the book.
Sign the book. We get some copies.
So thank you everyone for listening to this. It's been a fantastic conversation with Andrei Gómez Suárez. You can find him online everywhere, but keep an eye out for our posts about the book. Keep our online for developments and stuff that Andrei has been working on. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've been Richard McCollin Monboss, and this has been the Colombia Calling podcast. Goodbye.